It was supposed to be a night of elegance and alliances. Inside the glittering Langston estate, where gold fixtures gleamed under crystal chandeliers and champagne flowed like water, America's wealthiest families gathered to toast another year of market domination. The guest list was exclusive. The stakes? Billions. Real estate tycoons, hedge fund legends, politicians disguised as philanthropists, and, standing slightly apart from the crowd in tailored navy suits, was a black family who didn't quite belong, or so they were made to feel. Dr. Elijah Harper and his wife Simone were there on invitation, not by accident but design. He was a rising name in artificial intelligence, and Simone had just closed a major federal technology deal rumored to be worth over $3 billion. The Langstons needed them, though they'd never admit it. That's how power moves in these rooms, through calculated smiles and champagne toasts laced with quiet resentment. And Richard Langston, the billionaire host, wasn't known for playing fair. He was known for playing people. Midway through the gala, after the live orchestra had wrapped up its fourth rendition of Vivaldi and the room was drifting towards smug boredom, Langston raised his glass and turned to the Harpers with a condescending grin. His voice sliced through the string of polite conversations like a scalpel. "I heard your little girl plays piano," he said loudly enough for the room to quiet. "Why don't we let her entertain us? A bit of culture." Laughter followed. Not cruel, not yet, but expectant, mockery disguised as merriment. Imani Harper, just 10 years old, stood frozen under the ballroom lights. The room wasn't offering her a stage, it was offering her a trap. This wasn't an invitation, it was a setup. The kind of humiliation designed to remind a successful black family of the unwritten rules, how quickly admiration turns to amusement when you threaten the social order. Smartphones quietly rose from manicured hands, live streams flicked on, TikTok, YouTube Shorts, even LinkedIn stories, platforms that feed on spectacle. No one expected art. They expected awkwardness. A girl fumbling through Twinkle Twinkle on a grand piano, while billionaires sipped Bordeaux and whispered about diversity optics. But they picked the wrong child. Imani walked toward the piano not with fear, but with something far more dangerous to men like Richard Langston. Silence. Not defiance, not pride, just silence. She adjusted the bench, placed her fingers on the ivory keys, and looked into the lights without blinking. What happened next wouldn't just silence the room. It would go viral in under 6 hours, spark a national conversation on racial bias, and, most shockingly, wipe $3 billion from Langston's empire. Because some lessons don't come through lectures or lawsuits. Some come when the girl you tried to humiliate becomes the headline you can't escape. And when the music began, it wasn't just a performance. It was a reckoning. Dr. Elijah Harper had never been a man who liked the spotlight. A PhD in computer science from MIT, multiple patents in machine learning, and a billion-dollar acquisition by a Silicon Valley titan, all achieved without ever needing to brag. His brilliance spoke for itself. Simone, his wife, was just as formidable. A former investment strategist who now consults on federal infrastructure tech, she had recently secured one of the largest AI defense contracts in U.S. history. They weren't here to be impressed. They were here out of diplomacy. Richard Langston had courted their attendance for weeks, citing shared values, tech synergies, and opportunities for generational wealth. But beneath the charm, Elijah could smell it. That desperate scent of legacy finance trying to latch onto the future of technology. Langston didn't understand code. He understood control, and tonight he had planned to reinforce that in the most public, passive-aggressive way possible. The Langston estate wasn't just a mansion. It was a message. Marble lions flanked the entrance. Domed ceilings bore frescoes of Roman gods, as if wealth had been divinely granted. Waitstaff moved in military precision, serving hors d'oeuvres flown in from Paris, and every wall carried the scent of power, old money, old ego, old rules. Simone had chosen her gown carefully, sleek but understated, a nod to elegance without excess. Elijah's cufflinks bore his father's initials, a quiet reminder that their legacy wasn't built on inheritance, it was built on brilliance. But none of that mattered in a room like this. No matter their net worth or pedigree, they could feel it in the glances, the subtle pauses in conversation when they walked by, the too wide smiles, the "where are you really from" questions disguised as small talk. Elijah had grown used to it. It was the price of breaking into spaces never meant for him. But when Langston's request for Imani to play piano cut through the chatter, Elijah's stomach tightened. Not because he doubted his daughter, but because he knew this wasn't curiosity. It was condescension wrapped in performance. Imani had been taught piano by Simone's mother, a classically trained pianist who once studied in Vienna. By age 6, she was playing Chopin from memory. By 7, she could replicate entire symphonies by ear, but after a humiliating incident at a school recital, where a white parent had accused her of mimicking YouTube videos rather than playing for real, she stopped performing publicly. "It's not worth it, Mom," she had whispered after crying for hours. "They don't hear me. They just see me." And now, at 10 years old, she was being asked, no, used, as the night's entertainment, as a test, as a joke. Simone looked toward Elijah with a stillness that carried decades of silent strength. He gave the smallest nod. If Imani said no, they would leave. But their daughter, quiet and observant, had already made up her mind. The piano was a Bosendorfer Imperial, custom lacquered in pearl white. Its keys had never known anything but the hands of virtuosos flown in for Langston's curated events. Imani approached it with measured calm, brushing past the stares of 100 guests expecting a spectacle. Not brilliance, failure. Simone could see phones being raised. The TikTok generation didn't need cruelty to go viral, just awkwardness. Imani sat, adjusted the bench, and exhaled slowly. Her fingers hovered. For a single second, the entire room held its breath. And then she played. Not the simple children's melody they expected. Not something charming or safe. She launched into Rachmaninoff's Prelude in G minor, an aggressive, emotionally demanding piece that most adult pianists avoided unless they had something to prove. The opening chords were thunderous. Her fingers moved like lightning. The room, once buzzing with smug amusement, fell into stunned silence. Simone didn't blink. Elijah crossed his arms tightly, jaw set. Langston's forced grin began to falter as guests turned to each other with wide eyes. The hedge fund manager's wife whispered, "Oh my God." A retired symphony director in the back instinctively reached for his glasses to get a better look. The house staff stopped mid-step. Even the security guards watching from the monitors leaned in. The live stream comments began flooding with disbelief. "Wait, is this real? Who is this kid? She's better than the last guy Langston paid to play." Outside, a Rolls-Royce pulled up with a late arrival. Victor Chen, the tech advisor for the Department of Defense's AI Oversight Division. Unaware of what was unfolding, he walked in as the final crescendo hit, and paused halfway through the doorway as if hit by a wall of sound. His assistant leaned in. "That's the Harper girl," she whispered. "Their daughter." And just like that, the narrative began to shift. The mockery had morphed into marvel. The trap had turned into a triumph. But while the guests saw a viral moment, Elijah saw something else. He saw Langston's face, the twitch of disbelief, the flush of embarrassment, the dawning horror of a man realizing he'd just turned a high-value partnership into a national spectacle. This wasn't just a piano performance. This was a public relations disaster in the making, and Elijah knew exactly how to use it. Langston tried to save face. As the applause crashed like waves across the marble ballroom, he forced a hollow chuckle and clapped stiffly, glancing around to gauge the reaction. But it was too late. The energy had shifted. His attempt to control the room had backfired. Where there once was hierarchy, now there was awe. Guests weren't looking at him anymore. They were looking at the Harpers, at Imani, at the 10-year-old girl who had just made 100 millionaires feel small without saying a word. Victor Chen stepped forward, weaving through stunned onlookers, and made his way to Elijah. "Your daughter," he said quietly, his voice tight with emotion, "just turned a dinner party into a symphony hall. We should talk." Elijah simply nodded, his face unreadable. He knew what Victor meant. This wasn't just admiration. It was opportunity, connections, visibility, influence, and above all, leverage. Meanwhile, the clip had already begun its journey online. A tech blogger at the event, known for snarky Twitter threads on elitist culture, had posted a short video with the caption, "Billionaire throws a party to show off, tries to humiliate a black child. She plays Rachmaninoff instead. This is not the flex he thought it was." The tweet blew up within minutes, feeding the algorithm like gasoline. YouTube Shorts and Instagram Reels ripped the footage and added dramatic voiceovers, triggering virality on every social platform. Within the hour, Imani Harper was trending across the U.S. The Langston PR team, watching from a side room, went into full crisis mode. They had just lost control of the narrative, and worse, they had done it live, in front of key investors, government partners, and their most powerful competitors. Several guests had already slipped out, making quiet exits to avoid being tied to the debacle. Langston's COO was pacing the hallway, phone pressed to his ear, whispering in panic about optics, racial implications, and irreversible brand damage. Inside the ballroom, Simone knelt beside Imani, brushing a soft curl from her forehead. "You were perfect," she whispered. Imani just smiled faintly, her fingers still trembling. It wasn't just the performance, it was the weight of years lifted in a single act of grace. She had faced the same silence that once shamed her, and transformed it into reverence. As guests lined up to speak with the Harpers, Langston stood in the corner, isolated in his own house. He overheard one of the CEOs of a major venture capital firm say to Victor Chen, "If she's raised like this, imagine the caliber of the people running her household. I want that mind in my network." The compliment wasn't for Langston. It was for Elijah. The final blow came quietly. Victor leaned toward Langston with a tight, corporate smile and said, "We'll be moving our investment meeting to next week, with a different partner. You've made your values very clear." Langston stiffened. "Wait, Victor, this was a misunderstanding. It was entertainment. We're all friends here." Victor raised an eyebrow. "We don't invest in entertainment, we invest in vision." He turned on his heel, and with him went the remaining scraps of Langston's credibility. Back at home, later that night, Elijah tucked Imani into bed. Her medals and certificates, once boxed away after that painful recital years ago, would soon be displayed again. But tonight he said nothing. He simply kissed her forehead and turned off the light. And while Imani slept, the world kept watching. TikTok is flooded with duets and reactions. Music teachers cried on camera. Civil rights activists praised the quiet resistance. Wealth analysts noted how Langston Group stock was beginning to slide. Investors were pulling back. Questions were being asked. Why did a billionaire set up a child for public humiliation? And why did it take a piano to expose the power imbalance? The next morning, Forbes ran the headline, "Silenced No More, How a 10-year-old Just Shifted $3 billion in 3 minutes." But Elijah didn't need headlines. He'd seen enough. What Langston never understood was that true intelligence, whether in business or in music, doesn't announce itself with arrogance. It shows up when no one expects it. And sometimes it wears braids, patent leather shoes, and sits quietly on a piano bench before rearranging your entire empire. The piano bench was still warm when the first beat dropped, not from the instrument, but from the digital world that had begun echoing with seismic force. Imani's name spread like wildfire. Within hours, clips of her performance were being analyzed on YouTube by professional musicians, dubbed a generational talent and the embodiment of poetic justice. But the real explosion started not on music channels, but on business news networks. CNBC ran a special segment titled, "When Humiliation Backfires, how one girl's performance cost a billionaire his seat at the table. It wasn't just a feel-good story, it had become a financial reckoning. By morning, over 43 million people had watched the 60-second clip of Imani Harper playing Rachmaninoff at a billionaire's party meant to mock her. It wasn't edited. It didn't need a voiceover. The raw footage, her grace, the stunned audience, Langston's frozen smile, was enough. TikTok creators reenacted the moment with skits. YouTube commentators dissected the racial dynamics of the event in long-form essays. High RPM keywords like racial profiling, power imbalance, social justice, and humiliation culture fueled the algorithm. The story had become an engine. Langston Group's share price fell by 8.2% in a single afternoon. It had nothing to do with Imani, of course, not directly, but perception is currency. And now, Richard Langston wasn't seen as a power broker. He was the punchline in a cautionary tale. Corporate investors who once used his name as leverage began backtracking, citing PR volatility and tone-deaf leadership. A federal technology committee that had once sought his input for public-private partnerships quietly removed his name from its website. The next blow came during a high-stakes investor call scheduled 24 hours after the party. Langston, visibly strained, attempted to present a new AI infrastructure pitch to a group of venture capitalists and 2 Department of Energy liaisons. But midway through his slide deck, the lead investor muted him on the call and asked one question. "Would you have asked a white child to perform on command for laughs?" Langston stammered, but the silence that followed was louder than anything he could have said. Within minutes, 4 major stakeholders withdrew. The projected $3 billion merger with a government-backed innovation fund was officially canceled. While Langston scrambled, a new figure emerged from the chaos. Dr. Ramona Blake, a black senior analyst at the World Economic Equity Board. She gave an impromptu interview on MSNBC where she said, "What we saw at that party was not just racism, it was the weaponization of humiliation. And what we saw from that child was resilience born from generations of silence." Her interview was clipped and shared across political YouTube channels, educational platforms, and even investor forums. She invoked high RPM phrases like racial equity, corporate responsibility, and cultural intelligence, causing a wave of institutions to publicly reassess their partnerships with Langston Group. Within 48 hours, Carnegie Hall formally extended an invitation for Imani to perform at a youth prodigy showcase. The New York Philharmonic offered her a private mentorship program. A music YouTuber with over 10 million subscribers uploaded a reaction video titled, "She's Not Just a Prodigy, She's a Revolution." It featured a side-by-side breakdown of Imani's technique next to concert pianists, and the comparison was jaw-dropping. Suddenly, this wasn't about one girl being mocked at a rich man's party. It was about how systems underestimate talent when it doesn't come in expected packaging. Langston tried to respond with a formal press release. It was written by crisis consultants, filled with neutral corporate language and words like misunderstanding, regret, and support for diverse communities. But it landed like a wet matchstick. Too late, too hollow. The public wasn't interested in damage control. They were watching justice unfold in real time. And they weren't just entertained, they were invested. 3 nights after the incident, a private dinner was held at the Manhattan Club. This time, Langston was not the host. Instead, it was a gathering of major tech CEOs, venture capitalists, and public policy advisors, all of whom had once courted Langston's approval. Now, he sat quietly at the edge of the table, no longer the center of gravity. The conversation turned to ethics in AI funding. Dr. Elijah Harper, seated across from him, was invited to speak. Calmly, Elijah detailed the importance of moral alignment in tech partnerships. He didn't mention the piano or the party or the humiliation. He didn't need to. Everyone knew. And the silence that followed wasn't respectful. It was damning. By the end of the dinner, Langston had been unofficially blackballed, not by decree, by consensus, by In a viral masterclass review streamed by Juilliard faculty members on YouTube Live, Imani's performance became the centerpiece for a discussion about emotional intelligence in classical music. Professors called her technique organic, her phrasing surgical, and her instinct beyond her years. One of the professors, himself a child prodigy turned symphony conductor, said, "She didn't just play notes. She told a truth too big for adults to carry." A new hashtag was born, #ImaniStandard, and suddenly, parents, teachers, and even AI developers were referencing her in discussions of excellence, humility, and unexpected genius. Desperate to reclaim control, Langston made an appearance on a business podcast notorious for reputation recovery interviews. But the moment the host asked, "Do you feel remorse for trying to humiliate a child in front of your peers?" his mask cracked. He denied the intention, blamed social media, cited cancel culture. Then, as if unaware of the weight of his words, he said, "People are acting like she cured cancer. She played a song. That's it." The clip hit Twitter within minutes and detonated. Tech analysts called it the worst PR move of the year. Civil rights lawyers weighed in. One TikTok creator stitched the clip with, "Tell me you've never been humbled without telling me." Though the Harpers had no intention to sue, a class action attorney sent Langston Group a preemptive letter. Multiple clients, including staff present at the gala, were alleging a racially hostile event environment. News broke immediately. Suddenly, Langston wasn't just a meme, he was a potential liability. Even his board, which once revered his cutthroat approach, began drafting documents for executive transition strategy. In less than a week, Langston's status shifted from visionary billionaire to cautionary tale. Back at home, Imani sat alone in her room, a quiet evening humming through the windows. She wasn't on social media. She didn't need the noise. She placed her hands on the piano again, not to prove anything, not to go viral, just to play. Her fingers moved with the same grace that had once silenced a ballroom and now echoed through millions of hearts. Downstairs, Elijah looked at his phone. A notification popped up. Langston Group delisted from government project, 3.1B withdrawn. He didn't smile. He didn't celebrate. He simply turned to Simone and said, "All that, from one little girl and a piano bench." She nodded slowly. "No, from one moment of truth." Outside, the world kept spinning. Stocks would rebound, parties would be thrown again. But what no one could undo was the shift. A generational reminder that brilliance can't be boxed, genius can't be mocked, and when justice finally finds a melody, even the powerful forget how to speak. 3 weeks passed. The media cycle moved on, as it always does. New scandals emerged, new headlines took over, and yet one clip refused to fade. Imani's performance remained pinned to the top of every major platform's algorithm. Not because of novelty, but because it represented something bigger. The dismantling of old power through quiet brilliance. What no one knew, however, was that the real story hadn't even started yet. In a quiet office within the Department of Digital Equity and Innovation, a federal oversight committee met behind closed doors. At the center of the discussion, Richard Langston's former bid to manage a $3 billion artificial intelligence infrastructure grant. The contract had been frozen days after the party, but now it faced something worse than cancellation. It faced exposure. And not just because of bad optics. A confidential whistleblower had come forward with internal emails. Langston's firm had been actively pushing proposals that funneled government funding into front companies, shell entities connected to real estate investments and offshore tech farms in Belize and the Caymans. The files suggested he never cared about AI advancement. It was always about laundering influence, hiding money, and using tech buzzwords as camouflage. The whistleblower's identity was masked during the hearing, but Elijah Harper knew exactly who had stepped forward. It wasn't him. It wasn't Simone. It was one of the young analysts Langston had belittled in a strategy meeting just days before the gala, a black woman named Alondra Kane, a junior data scientist with a sharp mind and even sharper sense of justice. She'd seen the arrogance. She'd heard the laughter at Imani's expense. And that was her final straw. She downloaded the receipts and filed them where they would do the most damage, in the inbox of a federal integrity investigator with a background in financial forensics. The twist wasn't that Langston had mocked a child and suffered bad PR. The twist was that he had triggered a chain reaction, one that didn't stop at headlines but punched straight through the legal system. Within 72 hours of the file being reviewed, the Department of Justice launched a formal audit into Langston Group and froze all pending contracts. He wasn't just losing influence, he was under investigation. Simone was the one who received the courtesy call. A longtime advisor for ethical tech compliance, she had previously flagged Langston's early-stage proposals for lacking algorithmic transparency, a high RPM concern within federal AI circles. Now they wanted her back on the task force to help restructure the grant's review board. She didn't hesitate. Meanwhile, Elijah received a request for testimony, not in court, but on Capitol Hill. A televised congressional hearing on racial bias in public-private partnerships had been scheduled, and the committee wanted him to speak, not as a victim, but as an architect of integrity. He sat down with Imani one evening and explained what it meant. "People will watch," he said softly. "They'll remember the music. But now they need to hear the math." Imani didn't say much. She just nodded and went back to her sketchpad. She was drawing piano keys. Only this time, instead of black and white rectangles, the keys formed a staircase, one that reached into the clouds. Langston's camp tried to fight back. His lawyers threatened to sue for defamation. His board tried to silence employees. He went on Bloomberg and claimed it was all a coordinated smear campaign orchestrated by woke opportunists. But the court of public opinion had already ruled, and more damningly, so had the SEC. Financial misconduct charges were filed within 2 weeks. Subpoenas followed. Former allies went silent. And Langston, the man who once commanded rooms with a gesture, was left pacing his estate alone. No live streams, no clapping guests, just echo. But this wasn't just a story about downfall, it was a story about response. Not rage, not revenge. Something sharper, rebuilding from precision. While Langston's empire unraveled, Elijah and Simone helped draft the first-ever ethical AI representation framework for federal funding, ensuring racial equity, talent transparency, and youth access initiatives were tied directly to every approved budget. The clause became informally known as Imani's Gate, because that piano bench hadn't just been a stage, it had been a gate through which the old world collapsed and a new one began. The hearing room on Capitol Hill wasn't designed for poetry, but that day, it got some. When Dr. Imani Harper took his seat in front of the microphone, flanked by senators, advisors, and reporters, he didn't raise his voice. He didn't dramatize. He simply told the truth. He spoke of data, of systems that pretend to be neutral but inherit the biases of those who fund them. He spoke of his daughter, not as a prodigy, but as a symbol of what America loses when it equates wealth with wisdom and underestimates brilliance wrapped in black skin. His words were crisp, his tone composed. But when he said, "If my daughter hadn't played that night, Richard Langston might still be managing your taxpayer dollars," the silence in the room rang louder than any gavel. Clips from his testimony went viral. But this time, it wasn't just music lovers or activists sharing the story. It was educators, lawmakers, and tech leaders. One congresswoman tweeted, "That hearing just reset the conversation. Integrity isn't loud, it's precise." The video was remixed into educational reels on Instagram. On LinkedIn, diversity officers cited the hearing as a new model for corporate accountability and tech ethics reform. YouTube channels that usually covered finance and economics ran segments titled, "When Genius Meets Grace, the fallout of mocking the wrong family. The algorithm couldn't look away, and neither could the country. Behind the scenes, another shift took shape. Harvard reached out to Imani with an invitation to its youth mentorship program in classical composition. She hadn't even applied. A high-end piano company offered to custom-build her first grand piano, on one condition, that she choose the wood herself. But Simone gently declined the offers with Imani's blessing. "She's not ready to be a symbol," Simone said in a quiet email. "She just wants to play when the world stops watching." But the world wasn't done watching, not yet. Langston's empire continued to crumble under its own weight. A former assistant leaked internal memos showing the billionaire's intent to rebrand diversity at the party through visual integration. Translation: tokenize the Harpers, use their presence to clean up his image, then discard them. The memo included exact phrasing about leveraging family optics to humanize investor image. That leak was the final nail. The U.S. Attorney's Office filed criminal charges for fraud and misappropriation of federal grant applications. Langston's assets were frozen. His mansion, once the backdrop of champagne-soaked elitism, now hosted FBI agents removing hard drives and boxes of sealed documents. Meanwhile, Alondra Kane, the junior data scientist who blew the whistle, was promoted to senior compliance lead in the very task force Langston tried to co-opt. When asked by a reporter why she took the risk, she smiled and said, "Because when I saw that girl play, I realized silence was no longer neutral." Her quote became a caption on thousands of reposts. One TikTok creator stitched it into a video of Imani playing Chopin with the words, "The moment injustice met its match and lost." Back in the Harper household, things returned to something resembling peace. Imani practiced daily, sometimes in silence, sometimes humming along. She still didn't talk much about that night, but one morning over cereal she asked her father, "Do you think people clapped because I played well or because I surprised them?" Elijah took a moment, then said, "Both. But next time they'll clap because they remember you." That seemed to sit right with her. She nodded and went back to sketching piano keys again. This time they formed a bridge. In the final week of the fallout, Simone received one last call from the White House. They were forming a new AI oversight council and wanted her expertise. She didn't say yes immediately. She waited until dinner, looked at her family, and said, "Only if I get to bring other women with me." The answer came back in writing, "We welcome it." So in the end, Langston didn't just lose $3 billion. He lost control over a narrative he thought he owned. He thought power came from invitations, money, and architecture. He thought he could script humiliation and still walk away as the protagonist. But he underestimated the quiet force of someone who had nothing to prove and everything to protect. This wasn't the fall of one man. It was the rise of a different rhythm, a new tempo in how America views worth, intelligence, and who gets to hold the mic. And it all began with one girl, one piano, and one moment the world thought it was a joke, until it wasn't. On a quiet Sunday morning, far from congressional hearings and digital applause, Imani Harper sat alone at the piano in her family's living room. There were no cameras, no guests, no polished shoes tapping in approval, just sunlight spilling across the keys and the soft rustle of a spring breeze brushing the curtains. Her fingers moved gently, not with the intensity of performance, but with the intimacy of memory. The piece was simple. Clair de Lune, nothing explosive, just delicate, wistful. It wasn't a declaration. It was a breath. In that moment, there was no viral sensation, no prodigy, no billion-dollar scandal, just a child reclaiming the sound she loved before the world made it political, before strangers tried to define her by the shock of her talent, before she was anything but a girl and her music. And yet the world had changed. Langston's fall wasn't just a punishment, it was a pivot. Universities began re-examining how they identify giftedness. Diversity panels were no longer performative, they were policy. On YouTube, creators used Imani's clip to launch discussions on racial bias, representation in the arts, and economic gatekeeping in education. A music conservatory in Chicago opened a full-ride scholarship under her name, not for prodigies, but for overlooked children who'd never touched a piano until they believed it might matter. They called it the Quiet Genius Fund. At home, Simone began writing again, this time not white papers or grant reports, but a book. Its working title was When They Laughed at the Piano. It wasn't about revenge, it was about resilience, about the cost of dignity in a world that confuses politeness with fairness, about how injustice doesn't always roar, sometimes it smirks, and how sometimes the softest answer is the most devastating. Elijah, ever the builder, began mentoring a small team of black and brown technologists in Washington, future leaders of the AI systems America would soon depend on. One of the team members was Alondra Kane. Another was a public school grad with no formal degree, but an open-source resume that blew every standard metric away. Elijah didn't care about credentials. He cared about clarity, integrity, vision. And Imani? She never asked to be a symbol, but somewhere along the way she became something more powerful, a mirror. Not just for those who doubted her, but for those who doubted themselves. Girls who looked like her began showing up to piano recitals with their heads higher. Parents stopped apologizing for their children's brilliance in rooms that weren't built to see it. And in homes across the country, quiet kids started tapping on keys, not to impress, but to feel heard. Not every justice story ends in court. Some end in clarity, some in consequence. But the best ones, the ones that last, end in a shift you can feel but can't always name. A moment that splits before and after. That piano bench was never supposed to mean anything, but it did. It became the place where silence fought back, where grace rewrote a room, and where a billion-dollar lesson was delivered by a child who didn't need words to say, "You will never humiliate me again." And maybe, just maybe, that's the most valuable sound in the world.